Hi everyone, I'm Prerna. I'm a tutor with Premed Peers, and today we're going to be doing some MCAT passage practice, specifically for the Psych section. And we're going to be doing 3 passages from the Khan Academy MCAT preparation website. So you can go back to the website if you wanted to do this practice on your own and kind of see their reasoning. But we're going to be going through the passage and then answering some questions and kind of delving into why certain responses are correct and certain ones aren't. So this is the first passage. It's titled Patient with a Missing Cerebellum. I'll just let you pause and read through it and kind of absorb the material. And then when you're ready, you can play and then go to the next question. Okay, so first question is asking, what is a viable prediction from the mice study? So in order to answer this question, we need to go back to the passage and look at what our experimental results were from the mice study. So here it says the mice were divided into 2 groups, a control group that underwent the operation and another that was sham operated. So the operation being removing the cerebellum. And the mice were then tested for a number of factors, including hormonal levels and sensory awareness. Vision, smell, and taste abilities of the experimental group were not significantly different than the control group. And then hormones like testosterone and ADH levels were no different than the average. But cortisol, the hormone that instigates the fear response, had significantly lower levels in the experimental group. So that's the important piece of information that we need to know for this question. And so the correct answer is A, the experimental group will have decreased blood pressure because the only difference between the experimental and control groups is the cortisol level, and cortisol is involved with the sympathetic nervous system response. And so because the experimental group has a lessened sympathetic response, lessened cortisol levels, that's associated with decreased blood pressure. And so that's why A is the most correct answer. B is not correct because the cortisol group has the control group has higher cortisol levels, and that would cause a higher, faster heart rate. And then we'll kind of get into this with the later option, but right now we're using the experimental group to understand what the implications are of removing the cerebellum. And so this question is focusing on the experimental group and not necessarily the control group. And so going into the next option, the experimental group will have more relaxed bronchi. So that's not correct either because relaxed bronchi are associated with more sympathetic activation, and the experimental group would have less sympathetic activation. And finally, the control group will have slower digestive processes. This might be kind of a tricky one to choose between A and D, but D is less correct than A because right now we're focusing on the higher cortisol levels in the experimental group. And so using the experimental group results to make predictions about the control group is kind of less correct than the first answer. The first option is more correct. Okay, so question 2, what does the patient's ability to properly walk with minimal difficulty indicate about the brain? So for this question, I wouldn't say we really need to go back to the passage, but you definitely can to kind of see what the other context is. But the correct answer for this one is A. It is evidence of the brain's plasticity. So plasticity is the brain's ability to adapt to new situations. And so despite her cerebellum being completely absent, this patient is able to adapt and find new ways to walk functionally. And the cerebellum is supposed to be an important regulator of brain motor control. So there must be some plasticity in her brain that's regulating motor control some other way. B is not correct because we know for a fact that the cerebellum is involved in motor control. C, the cerebellum works with other parts of the brain to regulate movement. So in this patient, the cerebellum is completely absent, but she walks with minimal difficulty. So if she doesn't have a cerebellum, but she can still control her movement, it means that another part of her brain has taken over the role. It doesn't mean that they function interdependently. And then D, the cerebellum has other functions not fully understood. This might be true, but it doesn't really answer the question. The passage is talking about the patient without a cerebellum, so her mobility wouldn't indicate anything about the functionality of a part of her brain that's missing. So that's why A is the most correct answer. Okay, so question 3. What are some potential symptoms that the patient might experience? So we're going to go back to the passage. Her cerebellum is missing, and if we look at the CT scan, we can see what it looks like, and we can see that there's CSF filled in the area where her cerebellum originally would be. And also we can remember that with the mouse experiment, the levels of cortisol were lower in in mice without a cerebellum. So those are potentially some pieces of information that would be helpful here. So the correct answer for this is B. So let's just go through each of the options. First, she might be incapable of engaging in complex reasoning. No, that's the cerebrum is responsible for complex reasoning, and the patient's cerebrum is intact, as you can see in the CT scan. B, she might have had delayed language development as a child. So this is the correct answer because the cerebellum is not only involved in motor control, it also controls speech, and lacking a cerebellum might result in delayed language development for this reason. C, she might be unable to properly maintain her body temperature. So this isn't correct either because the hypothalamus is responsible for maintaining that homeostasis. And like we saw with the CT scan, the hypothalamus is intact like the rest of her brain. And then D, she might have difficulty remembering information. No, because the hippocampus is involved in recalling information. And again, the hippocampus is intact. So this question really asks you to remember what the different parts of the brain are responsible for. And so that you would probably have to pull from your own knowledge as opposed to pulling from the passage. So that's just something to consider with this question. Okay, so question 4, what might be an underlying consequence of the patient's condition? And so if we read through these options, it kind of hints to the fact that the question wants you to think about the role of CSF, especially in this patient, or cerebrospinal fluid, especially in this patient. So let's look at the CT scan again. So yeah, the empty space in her brain is filled with cerebrospinal fluid, which is important for immune processes and the prevention of shock trauma to the spine. So that's really important for answering this question. So that means that A is the correct answer. She has a decreased risk of contracting neurological disease because the passage states that CSF is involved in the immune response and prevention of shock trauma, and the patient has more CSF as a result of her absent cerebellum. That area has been filled with more CSF. So with more CSF, the patient might have an increased ability to ward off infection and disease in her nervous system. B is not correct because the hypothalamus is involved in control of sleep and arousal. And again, the hypothalamus is intact in this patient. C is not correct because with more CSF, she would actually have increased cranial pressure. So that's why C isn't the right answer. And then D, she would be more susceptible to physical cranial trauma. No, that's not correct either because like the passage stated, increased CSF in her skull would make her less susceptible to physical cranial trauma. Okay, the final question, where else might a large concentration of Purkinje fibers be located? So this one, again, is one that's really asking you to pull from your own knowledge. But we can go back to the passage and kind of see what their description of Purkinje fibers is, just to see if they give us a little more information. So the cerebellum contains a significant amount of Purkinje fibers, a specialized neuron hallmarked by its unique dendrite layer. Due to this distinctive structure, Purkinje fibers are able to accommodate more synaptic information than any other type of neuron. Because of this specialization, they exist in greater quantities where speed and efficiency of neural signaling is critical. They are often connected by gap junctions or desmosomes. Okay, so that's all that we get a significant amount of information about what Purkinje fibers are from this passage. So the only logical answer would be D, the heart. So Purkinje fibers are able to transmit high amounts of information quickly, and they're connected by gap junctions. And one of the hallmarks of cardiac muscle is that its connections are made of gap junctions as well. And the heart needs to be able to respond quickly to environmental changes in order to maintain homeostasis. And so the Purkinje fibers provide this quick information processing that the heart needs. The only other potential, I think, option that might trick some people is the biceps, because again, it's another type of muscle, but then it's important to recognize the difference in what activation of the heart looks like as opposed to the biceps. Okay, so moving on to the second passage, is obesity contagious? And then again, I'll let you pause this to read through it and take a look at the figure and kind of understand what's going on before we go into the questions. Okay, so question 1, which conclusion is best supported by the findings in figure 1? So I put figure 1 here. And going into the correct answer, it's C, but let's just go through each of the options and kind of understand why they're correct or why they're not correct. So friends of opposite genders only marginally increase the likelihood of obesity for the ego. And so we look at the figure, and actually opposite sex friends marginally decreased the likelihood of obesity, not increased. B, if a mutual friend living far away gained weight, the ego would not be more likely to gain weight. So that's not correct either, because mutual friends have a strong influence on the likelihood of obesity, and there isn't really a conclusion that can be drawn about this specifically from figure 1 about friends who live far away. C, there's almost no effect on the ego when someone in the same geographic proximity gained weight, and that's correct, because immediate neighbors or social ties within the same geographic proximity show approximately a 0% increase in the risk of obesity for egos. And then D, obese persons do not seem to selectively form social ties only with other obese persons. This figure doesn't tell us anything about this statement, so that's why this option is incorrect. Okay, question 2. Which of the following is not a plausible policy implication of the peer effects findings in the above passage? So I think the technique to use for this question is just to kind of read through these options and then go back to the passage and look at if anything connects with these options. So D is the only correct response, because this study emphasizes peer effects through social groups, contacts, and networks in influencing individual health behavior. And so plausible policy implication from these findings would not involve examining external environmental factors, but it would rather focus on utilizing social ties. And all three other options involve using social ties to make a determination. And so that's why D is the incorrect but correct answer for this question. So sorry if that didn't make sense, but it's not a plausible policy implication, but it's the correct answer for this question. Okay. Question 3. If the studies were combined to investigate the effects of social networks on food selection and how this food selection is associated with the likelihood of obesity, how would this change the design of the first study, social network effects on obesity? Okay. So A is not correct because when we're taking food selection habits into account, the model becomes social networks, then food selection, and then obesity level. And so food selection is still something that's important to consider. So there would be a change. A new independent variable is not added because when you're examining the effect of social networks on obesity, social networks would be the independent variable and obesity levels would be the dependent variable. A new dependent variable would be added. No, when we're examining this effect, social networks would be independent variable and obesity levels would be the dependent variable. And so finally, D is the correct answer. A new mediating variable would be added. A mediating variable is a variable that attempts to assess the mechanisms underlying the relationship between the independent and dependent variables. So food selection habits as a mediating variable would help clarify this relationship between social networks and obesity. So that's why D is the most correct answer. Okay. Question 4. Which of the following statements best describes the concept of homophily? So let's go back to the passage and see if they say anything about homophily. Okay. Homophily was taken into account by including a measurement of the alter's obesity. And I believe that's all they say about it. So we have to kind of infer things from that statement. So let's just again go through the options and see why certain things are correct and certain things aren't. A, smokers are more likely to experience cognitive dissonance with other smokers compared to non-smokers. So that's not correct because homophily, as we infer and as it's defined, is the tendency for people to choose relationships with other people who have similar attributes. So there wouldn't be cognitive dissonance around similar people in this case. B, individuals who are in the same geographical proximity are more likely to conform to the same health behaviors. No, this option doesn't take the individual's personal choices about relationships into account, so it doesn't have to do with homophily. C, obese people are more likely to change their unhealthy behaviors around non-obese people. No, again, this doesn't have to do with homophily because homophily has to do with people choosing relationships with other people with similar characteristics. And so finally, D, individuals with similar health risks, such as high blood pressure, are less likely to dissolve social ties with one another. And so that's correct, because homophily in social networks implies that individuals with similar traits are more likely to form social ties with one another, which often impacts their actions. So these individuals that share similar health risks, such as high blood pressure, are more likely to form stronger social ties with one another. Or if we look at it another way, they're less likely to dissolve their social ties with one another. Okay, finally, question 5. Which independent variable is most relevant for a study that solely investigates the impact of primary groups on health behaviors? So this is kind of more of a discrete question. It asks you to recall what primary groups are and what secondary groups are. So A is not correct because primary groups are typically closer and longer lasting ties, whereas secondary groups are more impersonal and temporary, like neighbors. B, religious affiliations can incorporate both primary and secondary groups, so it would not be the most relevant or correct answer. C is correct because siblings and other family members are often considered primary groups. So the effect of siblings on health behavior is the most relevant for assessing the effect of primary groups. And finally, D is not correct, occupational affiliation, because primary groups, again, are closer and longer lasting ties, while secondary groups are more impersonal and temporary. Okay, this is passage 3, navigating the stages of sleep. It's a little bit of a shorter passage, but again, I'll let you pause it and read through, and then we'll get into the questions. Okay, so question 1, what is atonia? So let's go back to the passage and see what they say about it. Okay, so REM is the stage where your most vivid dreams occur and is required to feel fully rested. It is also characterized by atonia caused by inhibition of the motor neurons. Okay, so that's what the passage says about it. So that's why A is the correct answer, skeletal muscle paralysis, because it's caused by inhibition of motor neurons, and atonia is skeletal muscle paralysis, thought to protect us from the damaging effects of acting out our dreams. B is not correct because motor neurons are inhibited, not activated, so we would not see muscle twitching. C, complete muscle relaxation. So that's not correct either because atonia occurs during REM and our eyes still move in REM, meaning that all of our muscles are not relaxed. And D, total muscle paralysis. No, that's not correct either because we continue being able to breathe in our sleep. So C and D are kind of similar, and they're both not correct. Okay, question 2. Sleep spindles are little bursts of high-frequency brain activity and are associated with maintaining tranquility during sleep. In what stage do sleep spindles first occur? Okay, so let's go back to the passage and see if it tells us anything about it. Okay, so since it's asking us about the stages, I think it's important to kind of read through what the passage talks about with the different stages of sleep, and what it kind of looks like. And so N1 is the onset of sleep where you experience hypnic jerks. And then N2 is light sleep where you spend about 50% of your night. N3 is deep sleep characterized by very slow brain waves. And then REM is the rapid eye movement, where your most vivid dreams occur. And so that's what this passage tells us about these stages of sleep. Again, also, it requires you to think about what the different brain waves are in the different stages of sleep. So N1 is not correct because N1 sleep is sometimes thought of as relaxed wakefulness, and the EEG activity resembles that of a very relaxed person. So that has theta waves. N2, this is the correct answer because sleep spindles have been shown to help people stay asleep when presented with auditory stimulus. And in this stage, you see theta waves, K complexes, and sleep spindles. C, REM. No, actually, in REM sleep, brain waves look similar to wakefulness, so you see beta waves, not sleep spindles. And then N3, that's also not correct because it's referred to as deep sleep, very hard to rouse from, and you see delta waves during that. So this question asks you to recall these different types of waves that you see in the stages of sleep. Okay, question 3, how many complete sleep cycles can be seen in figure 1? So the first cycle goes from the initial falling asleep through the end of the first REM stage. So on a hypnogram, this REM sleep is the level below wakefulness. There are four full REM stages, and so there are going to be 4 complete cycles in figure 1. So this asks you to kind of understand what the different stages are associated with on this graph. So yeah, going into that, question 4, if figure 1 is the hypnogram of a person with somnambulism, during which stage do you expect the sleepwalking to occur? So let's go back to the passage. And it tells us N3, known as deep sleep, is characterized by very slow brain waves. Sleepwalking, also known as somnambulism, occurs chiefly during this sleep stage. So we know that it happens during N3. So we just have to kind of trace our way through that figure and understand what stage is what part of the figure. And so we see the order of sleep stages is N1, N2, N3, N2 REM. And so you can see that here. And so N3 sleep is seen at the bottom of this hypnogram. So it's stage D. Okay, finally, question 5. What do you expect the EEG readings of REM sleep to look like? And so kind of recalling back to one of our previous answers, we understand that REM sleep looks similar to wakefulness, actually. So that's why C is the correct answer. So again, let's just go through the different options. A, REM sleep will not be full of sleep spindles and K complexes. That's N2. Alpha waves as seen in relaxed wakefulness. No, that occurs prior to falling asleep. C, high frequency sawtooth waves. Yes, REM sleep shows up as high frequency sawtooth waves on an EEG or beta waves. It is a period of high activity in the brain and looks very similar to wakefulness. And then D, very low frequency delta waves. That's not correct either because that's in N3. Okay. So those were the 3 passages. Hopefully it broke things down a little bit for you. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions, leave a comment. Yeah, hopefully this was helpful. Thank you for watching.